I invite you to take your Bible and turn to 1 Corinthians 16. We have been studying from 1 Corinthians for quite a while, off and on, and I'm very grateful for your patience with this study. We've not tried to be tedious. We try to recognize the fact that 1 Corinthians is just filled with all kinds of interesting questions and important instruction, of course, being inspired of God. And so, with that in mind, we've done the best we can to try and deal with a lot of the questions that are raised from this book, not suggesting that I have exhaustive knowledge or that I have dealt with every question or dealt with the ones I've dealt with always correctly. I've done the best I can with them. But I do appreciate your attention, and I invite your questions. And we're happy to have the occasion again to come to the last chapter and to look at Paul's instruction to this troubled but in many ways beloved church, that its example still lives, some good ways, some bad, but we certainly are instructed by this letter. And so in 1 Corinthians 16, the first 4 verses, we have this reading in the Old Translation. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall appoint by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me. First words are I think, familiar to us here. We've seen that a few times already now concerning. Paul is addressing a particular topic. Back in 7:1, it had to do with the question of whether or not it's good to be married or to get married. In chapter 8 in verse 1, now touching things offered to idols. And he addressed that subject in 8, 9, and 10. And then in chapter 12, now concerning spiritual gifts, and really 13 and 14 relate to that too, and directly. And then later on in the same chapter, in 16, in verse 12, he's going to be bringing up the topic of Apollos and about his moves and whether he'll be coming to Corinth, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But now he's talking about the collection for the saints. And, that's an important topic, and one that we need to know God's instruction about. The word collection in the Old Translation is defined as a collection, a contribution. The analytical Greek lexicon says the word appears in the papyri. What's that talking about? Well, the papyri is a type of ancient paper, and so works on papyri would be quite old. This goes back to ancient Greek writings even before the New Testament. So lexicographers, best I can tell, I'm not one, but what they did was they would study these old documents, and enough of them would use a word they could figure out how it was used, and then they can tell you how it was used in that age, and then perhaps that will enlighten us about how it might be used in ages to come. Context being important. So what they're saying is, in the ancient Greek writings, going back many years, it was used, this word logia, in the sense of a collection, particularly in the sense of religious collections for a god or a temple. Bauer, Art, and Gingrich add to that collection of money, especially a collection for religious purposes. So, what's the significance of that? It's a word that was used for some formal collection. That's the idea there. I don't know if you've been exposed to this or not. I can remember when I was a very young Christian, hadn't been baptized very long, didn't know which end was up, barely. I remember there was a bit of a hubbub, and there were some folks in the congregation where I grew up who had developed some rather curious ideas, and some of them had decided that really we had it all wrong when it came to the collection. There was no such thing as a collection in the Bible. It was just a very informal thing. So we just, if there's a need that comes up, we just go around and ask folks, and they'll hand us some money. And there's no such thing as a treasury. I remember him saying that. No such thing as a treasury in the Bible. You have no authority for that. Well, we'll see about that in just a minute. But I can remember somebody who was a lot smarter than me talking to this fella and trying to talk him down from this ledge and say, well, let me ask you a question. You say there's no such thing as a treasury. Well, how's it supposed to work? He said, well, if there's a broken window, we'll just go around and ask the brethren, for money to fix it. That's how you do it. There's nothing formal about this. And there's no treasury, he said. He said, really? Well, when you collected money from all these brethren, what do you do with that money? He said, well, I go spend it. What do you do before you spend it? I put it in my pocket. He said, well, then you got a treasury. It's just in your pocket. Just brethren sometimes I think miss the forest for the trees. But actually, when you look at the word that's used here, it has to do with a formal collection. One fellow wrote about this. Normally, the word, the last quote here, refers to a collection in the formal sense. In light of this fact, he adds, Paul was not instructing brethren to lay aside some money at home. Rather, he was instructing the congregation concerning a formal collection on the first day of every week. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the passage. Let's look again at this collection as a common practice. As I've given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. I'm going to mention this, and I'm not going to say any more about it right now. One of the questions that I've had about this passage, and I'm not sure that I have reached a dogmatic conclusion about it, the churches of Galatia. And what does he mean by that? Does he mean by that, as he sometimes does in 1 Corinthians, church in the sense of the church assembled, the assemblies in different parts of Galatia? Or is he looking at that as a local church? Paul uses the word ecclesia, I think, in both ways, in several senses in the book of 1 Corinthians. And I can't be dogmatic about which way he's using it here. I think previously he had been using it pretty clearly to describe the church assembled in 13, 11, 12, 14. But then again, I think he also uses it in terms of a local congregation. What difference does it make? Well, if he's talking here about the church assembled, that would suggest this is an activity of an assembly. A few years ago, when all of the COVID thing came along, brethren got it, and maybe some had this habit before then. They would just have a collection box somewhere in the building, and people could come by and sometime on the Lord's Day and drop their contribution in that box. And it really wasn't, there was no assembly attached to that. They were just simply, there was a place, a collecting place, and the church might not have been assembled. I might have been the only fellow in the building when I did that. And so if this is the church, the local church, then I suppose that'd be appropriate. If it's the assembled church, then that would not be the way to do it. My conviction about that is not strong enough to condemn, but I feel more comfortable the way we've done it here through the years. That's all I'd say about that. If I've raised more questions than I've answered, I apologize, but I just thought I needed to touch on that just as a point of honesty. Maybe you can help me with that if you have a clearer view. But at any rate, it was a common practice of the early church, this idea of a collection. And I think that there was common practice among early churches in reference to the worship and work of the church. We find here, I want you to do exactly what I told the churches in Galatia to do, 16:1. But that idea of a pattern of worship, we just had the meeting recently. We tried to, the point was emphasized there. And Brother Gable the other day had a lesson that was emphasizing this point. I don't think we can emphasize it too much. That we have to speak as the oracles of God, and we don't have the right, as so many today believe, that we can just sort of make this up as we go, and it doesn't really matter how you do it as long as you mean well, and whatever we decide is fine. That's just never been the way God's worked, has it? So it's interesting in the New Testament to look at how many times this idea of we're doing the same thing. There were churches in different places in the Roman world but they were all reading from the same book, the same teaching, that is, the apostolic doctrine. And so in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 17, Timothy, you remember earlier in this letter, was, we're going to talk about this also before the chapter's over, was coming, hopefully, to Corinth. He planned to be there. Paul wasn't sure exactly when he'd be there. But he said when he gets there, he's going to tell you about my ways which be in Christ, which I teach everywhere in every church. That's right. In 7:17, Paul there is talking about how that every man needs to hold to God above everything else, even a marriage partner. And he said, so I ordain it in all the churches. That's not a selective message for just the church at Corinth or just any other place. That's a message for every Christian, and it's true for all time, frankly. In 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 37, you remember how that Paul there, in giving instruction concerning how the gifts were to be implemented, he said, these things are the truth. And if anybody claims to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that what I command to you is the commandment of the Lord. What I give you, that's what goes. That doesn't just go here, it goes everywhere. The apostolic doctrine was that pattern. And when it comes to this subject, the only authorized means for the church to raise funds is what we find here. It was the voluntary giving of the brethren on the first day of the week. It was not car washes. It was not let's go down here to the local crossroads and get a bucket out, and say, hey, to the passersby, I give. That's not how the church raised its funds. It was not by creating some sort of a business. Maybe we'll start a school or a daycare. And whatever the business makes over its expenses then can go into the church. No, that's not the way it works. That's the way it works in with churches of men. But in the New Testament, that was not the way the funds were raised. Let's also notice here the purpose of this particular collection. The collection for the saints. It was for the benevolent needs of certain Christians. Benevolence is a word that maybe has gone out of style a bit, but it's not a complicated word. It just means we could say charity work, helping needy people. That's the idea. And so a part of the work of the church is helping the needy Christians. And if a need arises, it's right to take the collected funds and to use that for that purpose. A church has the right to do that. Part of the work of the church is benevolence of needy saints, needy Christians. I think it worthwhile to read these passages with you. Let's look in Acts chapter 11 and verse 27, because this subject comes up several times, several references to the same need, in fact. But I want you to notice that every time we read about a church using its funds for benevolence, it was always for needy Christians. In Acts chapter 11 and in verse 27, in these days, Luke writes, came prophets from Jerusalem unto Antioch, and there stood up one of them named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great dearth throughout all the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. Verse 29. And then the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren which were at Judea, which they did, and sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Here was a catastrophe. Here was a famine. It wasn't just going to affect brethren, but the church there was sending funds to a congregation in need, to the needy saints, the relief of the brethren. Well, that's just one example. Well, look in Romans chapter 15. Here's another occasion when you read about the church sending relief to the needy. But notice again the specificity here. Verse 25, Paul writes to the Romans, now I go to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, For it pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. He says again, the churches were sending money to needy saints. Look again, if you will, in 2 Corinthians. We read in 1 Corinthians a collection for the saints. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. 2 Corinthians 8:1 reads, Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit, we want you to know of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. Macedonia, you remember, was that province north of Achaia where Corinth was. So these were neighbors, as it were. I want you to know about the grace of God among them. What's he mean by that? Look at verse 2. How that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. When you mix poverty, deep poverty, with the joy of the Lord in honest hearts, what you get is not what the world would expect. What you get is generosity, abounding generosity. Verse 3, For to their power I record, and yet beyond their power, they were willing of themselves. That's interesting, hyperbole there. They gave beyond their power. That may be a little bit like people say, coaches say, I want you to give 110%. You ever have a coach tell you that? You know, they're not math teachers, are they? How do you give more than 100%? Well, you know what they meant. I know what they meant. Beyond their power. Verse 4, praying us with much entreaty, begging us, pleading with us over and again, that we would receive the gift. Almost felt bad about taking it. They said, we want you to take it. This was sacrificial giving. Giving for what? Well, he tells us in verse 4, doesn't he? To take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. I might mention this again. He says, this they did not as we hoped, but first they gave their own selves to the Lord, and to us by the will of God. Again, it's an occasion where churches are giving for the relief of needy Christians, needy saints. Chapter 9, verse 1. Let's just look at that. In 9:1, of course, we divide the book into chapters, but the same context here. For as touching the ministering of the saints, for as touching the ministry to the saints, it is superfluous, unnecessary for me to write to you. Churches giving of their funds to needy Christians. Church benevolence, always, without exception, was offered to needy Christians. What's the point of that? The point is that there's a typhoon somewhere, and maybe there's a hurricane that hits New Orleans. There are a lot of people hurting. God care about that? He absolutely does. Well, how about the church just gathered up some money from the treasury, send it down there, and just hand it out to the community and help it? Because that's not authorized by God. That's what's wrong with that. Let me be clear. It does not mean there's nothing we can do. What it means is when you look at the New Testament pattern, there's no authority for the church to use its treasury for general, we'll call it that, general benevolence. That's just not according. In fact, it's rather specific that every time this subject comes up, benevolence from the treasury, it was always for the relief of needy Christians. There's nothing we can do. There's absolutely something we can do. But what we do as individual Christians. Well, I don't think that's important. Well, it's this important. God authorizes one and not the other. Look with me, if you will, in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. By the way, through the years, there have been harsh and sharp divisions among brethren over this subject. Maybe this is a new subject to our young people here. But I promise you, folks that were my parents' age would have been well familiar with all kinds of ugly recriminations about people who who objected to using the treasury to help the world in this way. But they were simply standing on the precepts and the principle that it was not authorized. What about Galatians 6:10? I believe Galatians 6:10. As we therefore have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith. But again, with the passages we've read in mind, where churches always were involved in the relief of needy saints when it came to benevolence, I want you to notice in this passage, we're talking about individuals. How do you know that? The we is the idea of individuals. We as individuals. Look back in verse 8. Who's he talking to here? The local congregation or individuals? He that sows to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. That's not the church collective. That's each individual. Look back in verse 7. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Churches are not in that sense judged, but each individual is judged. Look back in verse 6. Let him that is taught in the word communicate to him that teaches in all good things. That's an individual. Look in verse 5. For every man shall bear his own burden. He's talking here about individual Christians. And he's saying that for the individual, your money, my money, not the treasury, we ought to do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. James 1:27 is another passage that has, I think, been stretched beyond its limits again, but it has a powerful message and one that we ought to take to heart. James 1 and verse 27. You remember their pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. Can the church, take funds and just send it to the needy in the world? Is this passage authorize that? Well, let's see, is this collective or individual action? To visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and to keep himself unspotted from the world. Look back in the previous verse. If any man among you seem to be religious and bridle not his tongue, this man, but deceives his own heart, this man's religion is vain. He's talking to us as individuals here. And he's saying to us that we have a responsibility to help all as opportunity affords, especially the household of faith. You'll meet someone who might say, and maybe you've heard people say this, well, I don't think it makes any difference. That's silly. It's a silly distinction. Whatever the individual can do, the church can do. Whatever the church can do, the individual can do. And I always think when people say that, you hadn't really thought that through, have you? With all respect. Because I think you can make that look pretty silly if you start trying to apply that. Whatever the individual can do, the church can do. You sure about that? But let me more gently point to a passage that shows that can't be so. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 16, and I hope this is a verse that you are well familiar with and that comes to mind when these types of things are discussed. Paul in 1 Timothy 5:16 wrote these words, if any man or woman that believes have widows, let them relieve them, let them help them, and let not the church be charged, that it may relieve those that are widows indeed. If that's the only passage that I had that was relevant to this, that would make it plain that not every good work is the church's work. It's a good work, I know, but not every good work is the church's work. There are some things that are good works that Paul said, don't let the church be charged with it. He said here, in fact, let the individual deal with that. And let not the church be charged. There's a difference between the work of the individual and the work of the church. There are some things the individual can do and should do that the church is not charged with. Like a friend of mine used to say, we can be generous with our stuff, but we're not supposed to be over here taking the Lord's stuff and using our will on that. We have to let His will apply to His stuff. And when it comes to the treasury, that's His, and He gives us the restrictions that belong there. And He's not hard-hearted, He's not mean, but He is, I think, crystal clear about this. And so what we're talking about in 1 Corinthians 16 is the church, in this case, helping needy saints. And that is a part of the work of the church. I want to try to make this point, if I may. That though this is the only authorized means for the church raising funds, the collection of the saints here, it's not the only work of the church. That's different. To say 1 Corinthians 16 shows us the exclusive way in which churches went out and raised funds or had their funds raised, yes. But to say that the relief of the saints is the only work of the church, no. Because we read about other things that the church was given responsibility to do. Let me just, looking at these letters to the Corinthians, make a point about that. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 8, written to the same people a little bit later, Paul writes, "While I was working among you, I was paid by other churches. I was robbing them, so to speak, in order to help you." This paraphrase, I think, gets to the point, which is that Paul had a right to take money from other places while working somewhere else in the gospel and trying to teach those that were outside, trying to encourage brethren. The church has a right to do that. Now, when a man says, and I've heard a few who've tried to say this, that we don't have any authority to raise funds for anything else but needy saints, and they use 1 Corinthians 16 as the limit, what they're saying is the church has no other work. You really believe that? You don't think the church's work involves teaching? If the church has a work, it has a right to fund that work. Whatever work God assigns it, it has the right to fund. But the only way I know of churches funded their work is by this collection. That may be elementary, but I do think it's important. Let me read another example. This time 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 11. Paul, writing about his time at Corinth, he had not taken money from them, but he made it clear he had a right to. "We have sown spiritual seed among you. Is it too much if we reap material benefits from you? If others have the right to expect this from you, don't we have a right, even greater right? But we haven't made use of this right. Instead, we have endured everything in order not to put any obstacle in the way of the good news about Christ." The point is that Paul said, I have a right to take church. Churches have a right, let's look at it from this end, to send funds to somebody over there to do the work of teaching. And churches had a right to support men in that work where they were. How are we going to fund this work? The only way we fund the church work is by the collection on the first day of the week. The church has more work than just benevolence. But there's no other way I know of to fund it except that which God gives. This voluntary contribution is the authorized way the church may fund its work. Its work includes other things, including worship, including edification, including evangelism near and far, and including charity for needy brethren. And by the way, I don't know any other work of the church. I don't know of any passage that authorizes the church from its treasury to fund work that would fall in the category of providing recreation or providing the idea of a common meal and association, or providing for secular education, or providing for medical care, just to maybe set up a blood pressure clinic and have that. I don't know anything about that from the Scriptures. What we find is God gives us the work and He gives us the means by which the church's work may be funded. Let's say a word about verse 2. The collection for the saints, the common instruction, not only at Corinth but in Galatia, etc. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him. There be no gatherings when I come. Upon the first day of the week, you may be aware of this. Maybe you've read this somewhere. And again, I'm not trying to play Greek scholar. I know very little about it. But it's interesting if you look in an interlinear and you look at the phrase here, it is kata mion sabbatou. Sabbatou, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? The word Sabbath. The word Sabbath in the Scriptures is sometimes used of the seventh day. But sometimes that word by metonymy is used for, standing for, the whole week. Not just the idea of the seventh day of the week, but a week proper. That is a usage of it. This is, don't take my word for that. The Word Study Dictionary, the second definition, metatomically, it denotes, this idea of Sabbath, denotes a period of 7 days, a week. And he gives some Bible references to make that clear. And among them will be Matthew 28. This is interesting. Particularly, you remember here at the end of Matthew, the resurrection account begins with these words, "In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre." It's interesting because the word Sabbath is used both senses here. At the end of the Sabbath, Sabbath day, as it began to dawn toward the first day of not of the Sabbath, but of the week. Sabbath used there for the week. So Sabbath can be used for a week. And it's clearly used that way a number of times. I think Mark 16 be the same context. Luke 18, maybe we'll read that or refer to it. This is the context in which you have this, two men are praying. One of them is the Pharisee who's full of himself. And he prays this way, "Lord, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even as this publican." Verse 12, "I fast twice in the week." I fast twice in the week. Well, he's not saying that I fast twice on the Sabbath. That wouldn't be much of a claim, would it? It'd be a pretty short fast. You fast twice in one day like that. But the word is used for a week. And it's used, and we could give other examples not to belabor the point. But it is, and that's why every translation translates it that way, by the way. I don't know many people that argue with that here. Almost the exact phrase is used in Acts chapter 20. I'll just pass this along for whatever it's worth. Acts 20 and verse 7. "Now upon the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread." If you have, and there are a couple of translations like this. One of them would be the New English translation. New English Bible, maybe, NEB. If you read the NEB, it reads, "Now upon the Saturday night." Because they take this passage and suddenly they decide, well, he wasn't talking about a week, he was talking about the Sabbath day. And by the way, the Seventh-day Adventists love that. They love that, but hardly anybody else does. That's the problem. Nearly everybody else understands that he's talking there not about the Sabbath day, but about the first of the week, Sunday. We could say more about that. Let me pass on that from now. But I think in passage after passage, we can see in the context that he's referring to the first of the week. Now, one thing that this shows is that the first day of the week was set apart and regarded by the church in a special way. The passage in Acts 20 comes to mind. Upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. This was the time when Christians gathered together for this special meal. This was the day that Paul had waited for. You remember, though he was in a hurry to make his way to Judea, he waited for a whole week so he could be there with the disciples on this day. Sometimes we have our friends who will say, well, when did Sunday become special? Well, it became special pretty early on. I think you can make the case that the events in Acts chapter 2 at the establishment of the church was on the first day of the week. And the Sabbath, which had been around a long time, Paul would go into the synagogues on the Sabbath day in order to meet with and to have a chance to teach the Jews. But on the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. This was a day special to Christians. I think we see that in Acts 20, and I think it's reflected in our passage. This is a special day. This is a day in which Christians met to do things on that day that they did on no other day. And Vincent makes the point that the force of this expression is every first day. How often does the first day of the week come? It comes every week. And so upon the first day of every week, they were told to lay by in store. You know, it's interesting, and others have made this point through the years. I've talked with folks, and you probably have too, and their practice is that, we take the Lord's Supper once a month, or we take it once a quarter, we take it once a year, we take it on Christmas or whatever. And you'll say, well, it seems to me that in the New Testament that the disciples came together on the first day of the week. And they'll say, well, that's just the way they did it, but that doesn't mean we have to do it that way. But almost the exact same expression in 1 Corinthians 16. You don't have to convince any of these groups that you have to take up a collection every week. In fact, they'll take it up, multiple times a week. I just found that interesting. Suddenly when we come to 1 Corinthians 16, we understand what it means when he says the first day of the week. Oh yeah, we need to do that regularly. Something is missing, it seems to me, there in the logic. In verse 2, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store. I'm going to close in just a minute here. I'd hope to get a little further, but we will, Lord willing, we'll get this finished directly. But in verse 2, every one of you, I think that expression ought to strike us. It suggests the idea of our giving as being an individual action, an individual responsibility, personal, individual. Every member, every member, as opportunity allows to give. It's based on opportunity. It's based on ability. Can I go back real quick to 2 Corinthians 8 and notice with you, Paul, when he's praising the church at Macedonia and trying to use that to encourage the brethren at Corinth, he said, he talks about their generosity of spirit. He talks about how they gave themselves to the Lord. And when a man gives himself to the Lord, it seems to me then the rest of it just falls naturally. You don't have to beg folks. You don't have to squeeze them to get them to give. When they're given to the Lord, the rest of it follows. But you love verse 12, don't you? Where Paul writes, for if there first be a willing mind, it is accepted according to that a man hath, and not according to that he hath not. God never expects of me more than I can do, but he does expect of me all that I can do. I like what, I made a note in my Bible. This is a quote from, I think, the CEV. Not always accurate, but always interesting. The CEV does have some good paraphrases, and so he writes, it renders it this way. It doesn't matter how much you have. What matters is how much you're willing to give of what you have. That's a pretty good summary of that, I think. Where's your heart? That's the question. Every one of you have the right heart. Every one of you lay by him in store. This is another expression that I think is maybe we misunderstood at times, if I understand it. The word there, lay, is a word which means to deposit. Pretty straightforward. Matthew chapter 27, when Jesus died, they took the body down and they lay it in the tomb. Acts chapter 3, he was a lame man in Jerusalem, and somebody would come every day and lay him at the gate. So we know what it means to lay, to deposit. Mr. Hart says about this expression here, the words do not mean to lay at home, but rather to lay by himself. That is, to take to himself what he means to give. But I think the context would indicate not something done privately and individually, separately, but the idea of something done together. Think about it. Paul calls them then to collect. Remember that idea of formal collection, logia. In store. There's the word treasury, by the way. The brother earlier who said he didn't find a treasury in the Bible? Well, it's right here. That's the idea of laying in store. Where you put that treasure is a treasury. And it's done on Sunday, the first day of the week. When people have interpreted this as suggesting that we just individually lay something by and wait for Paul to get there, I don't think that fits the passage at all. It suggests rather the idea, what difference would it make what day I laid it aside at home? This is something done together. That's why the timing is significant. When you come together on Sunday, treasure up what you've been given, what you decided to give to God. That there be no further need for gathering. And that's the same word, collection, logia. When Paul comes again to gather up for this need will have been met. This need will be in the treasury. And so I think everything about this, when you take it this way, suggests a formal and a collective gathering of funds at a particular time, the first day of the week, that the church may not have a need to scramble around trying to gather funds when Paul comes for this need. This need has been treasured. It's been met. And notice again, as God has prospered him. I don't rush through that. I will pick up there next time. And we can finish out, I think, the rest of this chapter, I hope, in a timely manner. But I do think that expression is obviously significant. So let me deal with that at a later time. But I thank you for your patience. If I've raised a question today, or if you have a disagreement with something that I've said, I know that you'll feel free to talk with me about that. And I'll be very glad to listen to you and maybe get help from you. Okay, please take your songbooks and turn to the number that's been selected. If someone here tonight would desire to give themselves to the Lord, we know how to do that. We have instruction in the New Testament how to do that. It starts with hearing, I guess. Faith comes by hearing. You have to know and understand the gospel. And if you would like further help on that, be glad to talk with you. But you have to decide to believe it. Every person has to decide for themselves. And a man who believes it is going to be moved to make the changes that it demands. And is not going to be ashamed to tell the whole world, I believe that this man is exactly who he claimed to be. He's God come to earth. He's the Lord in Christ. And what I want to do then is obey him and his instruction to be baptized into Christ for the remission of sin. Raised to walk a new life. Be his own. That can be your decision tonight. And we'd be glad to help you with that. As a child of God, if we're not faithful to the promise we made, we need to change that. You know that. I know that. And he longs to receive us. He's gracious. But he will not wait forever. So now we have this opportunity. Now we must take advantage of it. And if we can help you with that, we'd also love to do so. Let us know how we can help right now while we stand, while we sing.